Hello everyone, I'm Thomas Lancaster and welcome to this overview of the book chapter Assessment and Plagiarism, which is part of the Cambridge Handbook of Computing Education Research. It's a chapter that I wrote along with Anthony Robins and Sally Fincher. And you can see the book here. Really great book to find out more about what's going on in computing education research, some of the big questions of today, particularly useful for new researchers in the field. But I guess I should stress that everything is from a computing education context. So my background, I've done a lot of research into plagiarism in particular, some into assessment. The areas are intertwined, as I will come to during the course of this video. But much of my research, despite being a computer scientist, has been quite as a generalist, trying to apply this to all subjects. And in my wider research, I often argue that we should be looking at educational and pedagogical research on a subject level. And that's what Sally and Anthony, as the editors, have tried to do with this book. So things can be applicable. There is a certain amount of technical content in there as well for people outside the field. And just a little bit more about how this video has come about. I did a very short version of this talk for the SIGCSE conference, which took place was scheduled to take place in Portland, Oregon in March 2020. Due to COVID-19, it took place partially online, partially not at all, but people have viewed the short version of this recording. But this video is just letting me go into a bit more detail and a bit more depth. But of course you can pick up the book for the details of this and many other useful chapters as well, and I encourage you to do so. It's very accessible, particularly if you're within the computing field, very timely and up to date as well. So this chapter came about essentially because when Sally and Anthony were putting together the table of contents, trying to cover as many areas of computing education research as possible, they asked me to focus in, aided by them, on the areas of plagiarism and assessment, because they consider them very closely intertwined, as I do. But if you were to look in the literature in this field, you would find out that actually very few papers refer to both areas. So within the computing field, there's a lot of work on how to detect plagiarism, treating this solely as a very technical problem. There's lots of separate work about assessment design to go alongside that, but very little of that is taken together. And I wrote a post on my blog at thomaslancaster.co.uk/blog about that, and I found out the time essentially of doing this study, when I put the blog post up to coincide with it, that since 2013, 56% of papers relating to plagiarism also refer to assessment. But looking in the other direction, only 18% of papers on assessment even mention plagiarism. So in terms of assessment design and planning how students are assessed to see if they meet the learning outcomes of a module, then very few papers consider plagiarism in any form as something relevant. Now, is that a problem? In some of my wider research, I do certainly argue that it can be, because although we should never be designing assessment purely to minimize opportunities of plagiarism and academic misconduct, we should essentially be designing it to be good assessment, then we do need to put plagiarism and academic misconduct, academic dishonesty as our considerations in there as well. Here's a very traditional quote from the field dating back to Roundtree 1977 paper. The spirit and style of student assessment defines the de facto curriculum. So what does that mean in practice? Traditionally, many subjects have been purely based around students passing exams at the end of the year or the end of a course. I studied a degree that was very much like that. But students then are learning for the exam. They're probably trying to do all their assessment, master the skills at the very end of a year, as opposed to being integrated within it. There's a very high risk of failure with that style of design, because if things go wrong during the exam period, then you've wasted 1 year, 3 years, 4 years, whatever it may be. So the incentives for taking the risk and cheating in some form are very high for students. By the same time, you could have an entirely assignment and coursework based curriculum. You're perhaps also taking a risk as a faculty member, an academic, an educator, by taking that view as well, because it can be very easy for a student to look to outsource their work in many fields, including computer science, where programmers can be hired by the hour or by the task. So my view in terms of assessment design is always to take a balanced approach with that. Well, what is the purpose of assessment? We pick up on this in much more detail in the chapter itself, but I've split this down into both the general purposes and specifically for computing and what's different. Generally, we are trying to see if students have met the learning outcomes of a module, of a course. Have they achieved what's required? Have they mastered what's required? Mastery could be considered a higher standard than achievement there. How well have they met this? As educators, this gives us a measure about how good our teaching is as well, because if our students haven't achieved very well, does that mean that we have set the assessment at the wrong level? Does it mean that we haven't taught them very well? Does it mean that we haven't engaged them in the assessment? Are we assuming too much prior learning? Are we just overloading them with tasks? So it also gives us this idea about seeing how well students are progressing, which is where we have the idea of assessment quite often being formative. So it's designed to help students see how well they're progressing, not necessarily to carry a mark, which would be a summative form of assessment, but also it lets us see how well they're progressing. So do we need to put interventions in place for a particular student? Are we not stretching our top performing students far enough and providing them opportunities to go above and beyond? That could be an issue in computing in particular, where we have some students arriving who are already experts in programming. They've done this from a long age, it's engaged them. They may not follow our preferred style of programming. They may take some shortcuts we don't like, but essentially they know the basics. But at the same time, we may also have some people arriving who have never programmed before. And that leads us well to this area, which is mostly in the computing education research, which isn't necessarily looking about assessment in general, although we still have written assessments in computing. We probably still have project reports, capstone projects, but also thinking about, can students program? And that's going to be one of the biggest questions when they come to apply for jobs afterwards, when they sit technical interviews, when they try and impress recruiters. We need to show that they've built up that portfolio showing everything they can do on their course. So we need to bring this purpose of assessment into the work we do as computing educators. There are lots of questions about things we could do based on current research to improve computing assessment. Here are just 3 of them picked from the book chapter. One area that comes up quite a lot is to do with tests or quizzes, a term that's quite often used. It probably makes the test sound just a little bit more fun than they would be otherwise if it was a quiz rather than a test. But how can we use quizzes to improve student learning, to evaluate where they've reached, to perhaps redesign their future learning and the type of tasks they're asked to do? And we see multiple choice questions used quite a lot within computing education. They work very well if they are well designed. The problem with multiple choice questions so often is they're just not so well designed. So what can we do to make sure multiple choice questions are fit for purpose, they accurately assess whether people have the correct knowledge or they don't have the knowledge, that we don't try and just trick students with incorrect answers, and we don't put answers together that are just wrong, as so many multiple choice questions are. We also don't have that style of tests, which means that actually you can eliminate answers without knowing anything about the subject, because you can just work out where they contradict one another, or they contradict the questions, so they can't possibly be true. Another question about assessment, particularly to do with programming: can we assess concepts rather than syntax? Because we expect students to leave us and be able to program in whatever language is current, whatever language or paradigm is used by a particular company or within a particular industry. Or as things change there, how do we make sure they understand the underlying concepts and perhaps they're fit to continue to learn and develop and for lifelong learning in the future? There's also this word gamification that appears all the time now. Can we split our learning and our associated assessment up into smaller tasks that engage students and make students want to get to the end of each task? Perhaps they receive points or they receive badges. That same kind of gamification that makes you keep playing a game, that every level is so appealing. You think of something like Candy Crush, where people keep doing level after level after level because every level looks like it can be completed very quickly. There are all kinds of rewards if you complete a level, and it's designed to keep you continuing the game and keeping you spending money. How can we use gamification within the computing syllabus to go alongside that just as well? Now, the associated area with assessment I mentioned, often not considered at the same time. Think about how you can do this without plagiarism. And this really has been my main area of research since my PhD days, and continued on, perhaps slightly more generally than just plagiarism now, looking at the wider aspects of academic integrity to go with that. But plagiarism essentially means students are not doing their own work. They're finding existing ideas, they're getting code from other people. And again, we're thinking particularly in terms of source code plagiarism here for the purpose of computing assessment, but this is equally valid when you think about written assessment, textual plagiarism, even plagiarism in other types of computing assignments, whether it's working on a spreadsheet, developing a database, whatever it might be. So what are the risks? Is plagiarism particularly likely within computer programming? Well, many people argue that it is, because you need a greater level of understanding of how source code and software is structured than you do with just writing a written assignment. This means students can become frustrated very quickly, that they may not have had the prior experience other students have, so they feel they're behind there. We see plagiarism occurring quite a lot just in CS1 level work, just when students are joining a advanced education, higher education course, not necessarily waiting until later on. So there is a real risk of plagiarism, whether it's in terms of collusion, students copying from one another, or perhaps forming what they might refer to as a study group, but when this is not something that we consider acceptable from our own way of looking at things there, but also finding answers on the web. And so many answers now available on sites like Stack Overflow, on GitHub archives, on code repositories. They can be in the form of fragments, they can be in the form of full answers. And in many universities, there are often internal archives of answers of previous work that students have access to. Think of the old, let's take maybe a North American example, the old fraternity days, where fraternities would build up a set of answers to previous essays available for later people. And so we have a risk as educators, if we set the same questions again and again and again, there'll be answers that are ready-made that are out there. And we're perhaps tempting students to breach academic integrity by doing so as well. But the reasons for plagiarism, both in computing and in other fields, are very varied. It's not always entirely the fault of the student, although, of course, they're never completely unaccountable either. And there is a challenge in this as well, because at the same time that we're saying that students shouldn't plagiarize, perhaps we're presenting this as a bad idea to them, we're also looking at the wider skill required by industry, which is that students will work in teams to develop software and they will reuse software, perhaps from an internal code repository, perhaps by finding answers that are appropriate and using code fragments online. And it's very rare that we're ever in a situation as a programmer where we haven't got guidelines we can look at, we haven't got manuals, we haven't got previous answers, we haven't got access to the internet. So how do we account for those different areas? A big question to think about. And one way, we talk about this more in the chapter that I like to think about this, is to split up the level of skills that students require within different years of study, so that in the early years when they're first learning, we want to know they've mastered the basic concepts of programming, that they can use the syntax for a particular language, even though we shouldn't be particularly syntax driven, without having to look things up. But as they go further on, we should be thinking about reuse, so long as they can acknowledge where they have reused code from, and they don't reuse code that they don't have permission to use there. There is an associated problem. This has been part of my wider range of research for many years, and you'll find out much more about this, which is the area of contract cheating. Essentially, a student is getting someone else to do the work, and this means they're probably getting completely original code written. They're not just going and finding a ready-made answer. It can make it very hard to use any of the technical tools that are available in computing to detect this. And my research dates back to a site called Rent-A-Coder, which does pretty much what it says on the tin, that you can hire a programmer. You can often hire one from an economy where they can work very cheaply compared to Western standards. So it costs students next to nothing to get a basic assignment done for them. That site doesn't exist, at least in that format now, because it's been taken over since, but there are many other sites available students can use, and a student can even just get a friend or family member to do their programming for them. It can be very hard to detect. So how do we detect work which is original but which isn't plagiarized? Can we consider areas such as the style of programming to help us to do this, or can we look at other methods of verifying who is doing the work? And this can be when it's quite useful to have students within a controlled situation to look at this. So there are other questions in the chapter specifically relating to contract cheating, but I'm really interested about how we combine together the research questions involving both introductory programming, plagiarism, and contract cheating, how we look at the assessment types that are most susceptible, can we develop better assessment which also engages and interests students, and what is the theoretical underpinning of this whole area? Many areas of pedagogical research have a great theoretical underpinning. There isn't a really brilliant one specifically for computing, from my experience, that I think is that relevant. There are obviously underlying ideas that you can apply there, but what can we do to bring these fields together? What can you do as a researcher as well? So there are so many opportunities for continued work on assessment and plagiarism. I would encourage you to read the chapter and to explore these in more depth. By all means, contact me and connect with me as well. I'm at thomaslancaster.co.uk, but there are many more ideas in the chapter, and you can discover more inside Assessment and Plagiarism. That's one of many very interesting chapters, putting together a research base about what our current understanding is about computing education research and where the field should be moving forward. It gives great ideas for future research studies, great ideas for improving student education, ideas for potential PhD topics as well. And if you're a computing researcher, you haven't moved in the educational field, do take a look at this book. So again, the chapter I was involved with, Assessment and Plagiarism, co-written with the two editors of the book, Sally Fincher, Anthony Robins. Do contact me if I can help. Do take a look at the Cambridge Handbook of Computing Education Research.